Hello, I am Andy Golloher. I was supposed to present with my colleague, Jiyoon Lee. Unfortunately, she had a family emergency and she had to be absent today for that. So I do want to, first of all, welcome you to the session, Creating Inclusive Early Childhood Environments Using Physical Activity. Earlier this morning, in the same room, there was a session on using physical activity in K-12 schools. I didn't realize that. It was very exciting. And so these sessions will hopefully complement each other. Unfortunately, my colleague is the professor in kinesiology, so she is the one who really understands physical development and physical activity, and she's the one who teaches in our adapted physical education program. I am an early childhood special educator, and so I know about preschoolers. And so I hope I'll be able to answer any questions that you have. If you have questions during the presentation, feel free to just shoot a hand up. We're going to get started today by talking about kind of why are we talking about this before we start talking about strategies. The issue that brought us together. So it's a bit unusual at the university for people to work with each other across departments. But the issue that brought us together is this really interesting research that really shocked me about the low levels of physical activity. And you'll see this throughout. PA is for physical activity. Low levels of physical activity and high levels of sedentary time among young children in early childhood settings. And that shocked the heck out of me because I, having been a preschool teacher, felt at the end of the day, I would be exhausted, right? Like I was very physically active in my job. So it was really surprising to me when I heard this research about the low levels of physical activities that young children are engaging in. It turns out the adults are moving around a lot more than the kids. And this is an issue on multiple levels. I'm not sure I can say the first one, but one of the issues, and we know this from our developmentally appropriate practice, that for young children, learning doesn't happen like separately in different domains. And if you are activating multiple domains, we're having deeper and more meaningful learning. And so there's some really good research on the way that physical activity actually supports learning and development in other domains as well. So if children aren't being physically active, they may be missing some of those opportunities to learn and engage. It's also something that when we got together as colleagues that we talked about, that when we're thinking about young children with disabilities, sometimes the way that they're able to participate is through physical activity. If, for example, they're not yet communicating or don't have a communication system in place, but they can still participate physically. And thinking about the use of physical activity can actually help us think about how we might develop meaningful, inclusive opportunities for young children with disabilities. So here's this research. Children spend most of their day, like over 80% of the day, either sedentary, that means sitting, or low intensity. And when I was reading this article, or it was actually a chapter by Brown, one of the things they commented about, and I was like, oh, yeah, that actually sounds right, was that a lot of times we plan our days where we have like times that we think are going to be physically active, like we're going to go outside to the playground for, a 30-minute period, and we think of that as like the physical activity time. And while some kids do spend all of that time, or most of that time moving around, other kids might do this. And this is actually my daughter. If she went out to the playground, she would often be digging, and that's great, right? We don't want to stop kids from digging, looking, exploring. And this is really great engagement, but it's actually not physical activity. I mean, you're using your hands, but other than the fact that you're using your hands, you're not using the rest of your body. And so when I read that and I thought about that, I was like, okay, I can think of how that played out in when I was a teacher as well. So what do we know about physical activity in early childhood education settings? One of the first things that we do know is the classroom is or the environment is the third teacher. So it's going to influence the way that children interact with their environment. and can influence their physical activity. In some way, it's kind of annoying that this is going to be, I don't want this to be one by one. Okay, but some ways that the environment can influence children's physical activity is the amount and type of equipment. So when I was at schools that had trikes on the playground, kids actually were more active throughout than at schools that didn't have tricycles, right? Because they had like something to do. There also the ability to be outdoors. I know some programs, they spend about half their time outside, right? Like you're in and out of the classroom. The outdoors is just an extension of your classroom. Other programs, and I think this happens a lot more when we're in public schools, you have your allotted time. Like this is your 30-minute time, right, that you can be outside. And so we don't necessarily have the outdoor space the same way. And also just the size of our indoor and outdoor spaces are going to influence the type of behavior that we as the adults deem to be appropriate and that the kids are allowed to engage in. We also know that adults can influence children's physical activity. So adults can influence this, so that kind of goes back to that, what sort of things are we planning for outside? So having this intentional planning for physical activity, thinking about, so the speaker this morning did a great job of thinking about just ways to embed different physical activity breaks throughout the day. That can really increase physical activity. And we also know that administrators and center policies can influence physical activities. So it was a southern state, like Louisiana, somewhere down there. There was a state that actually, so we don't have national guidelines on how much time children should be outside as part of their day. There's kind of like, there's professional guidelines, but there's no national recommendation, for example, for Head Start. But I think it was Louisiana. They actually put in a policy for all of their publicly funded programs about how much time kids needed to have outside and how much time they should be spending in physical activity. And guess what? That increased physical activity because it communicated to the teachers that this is actually something that we value. And I know that that's not always what's communicated to early childhood educators. Sometimes it's almost like the opposite. It's like how much learning can we get in? Especially if you have short days, 3 hours, how much learning can you get in? And we start to push physical activity aside because it's not viewed as real learning. When, as I said before, the research suggests that it can support learning. And this is something I think, early childhood educators know, but it needs to be supported, is the way that physical activity can be infused with learning in other domains. And this researcher, I don't know how to pronounce her last name, Mavalidi, she has like a whole line of research using physical activity to teach geography, using physical activity to teach math concepts. And consistently, when kids have integrated opportunities to be physically active and to learn content, they learn it better. They have more retention of the concepts than if they have just learned it in a more sedentary fashion. And so it kind of switches around our thinking. I know back when I was in school, people were still talking about like the learning styles. But shifting into this like multimodal, like we're all multimodal learners and having the, as UDL says, multiple on-ramps to the concept, right? And so I think one of the mechanisms here is this idea of having that multiple on-ramps, and I take the on-ramp that works for me as we're engaging in these different activities. So what are the challenges that we face with physical activity in early childhood? One challenge, and this is, kind of harkens back to what I said. I should have actually let you guys answer that question before I started giving you answers. Does anybody, so you saw one, but there's others. What are the challenges with embedding physical activity throughout the early childhood day? Does anybody want to share? Yes.
It makes teachers give up a degree of control that they're often comfortable doing.
Yeah.
Like the control you have by having taken activities, having an adult sitting with them, guiding the activity versus
That is, so for those of you zooming in virtually, the comment about how it requires teachers to give up at least the perception of control over the learning, where you might feel more in control if you're sitting down at a table or in a center with the children. Anything else? Any other barriers or challenges with implementing physical activity? Yes.
I was just going to say, sometimes staffing, because
Yeah.
get, I guess, more the energy level might go up a little bit with
Yeah.
that physical activity.
Yeah. So the comment for those, again, virtual, is the issue of staffing and being able to monitor. I don't remember if that went into this, if it made it into this slide or to this presentation, but there's some research on that outdoor time. And with teachers who did this whole PD about physical activity and stuff, and they're like, yes, it's great, but when we're outside, we actually, we need to make sure all the kids are safe. And so if I go and facilitate, when 5 kids want to join in, because we're early childhood educators, we don't force kids to join into things, right? 5 kids want to join into this game, and then, so the other 15, does that leave the other teacher with the other 15? And so that's a real, I think, concern in thinking about those resources. And as Shelley Moore just told us, we never agree. We always need more resources, and I think that's true. Okay, any other challenges?
Sometimes as you're doing music and movement activities, for example, some staff admit to that as being a weakness.
Yeah.
They dance, they don't like to move in those
Yeah, your own personal comfort with that, your view of yourself as a dancer or as a athletic person. Yeah, I know, I never conceptualized myself as an athlete. That's not people don't usually look at me and think oh yeah, you're an athlete. But then having to kind of take on that persona. I think those are all really great. And so, yeah, so one of the first is this idea of the teacher's perceptions of physical activity. But I don't think that, what you all said, here's the physical activity is disruptive is on there. But also the first one is what I've had as my bias is it's also natural. Kids are just naturally physically active because they wear us out. And so we don't need a plan for physical activity. Also we shouldn't interfere with physical activity. Whatever level of physical activity the children have is natural and fine. Can influence how teachers plan for it. This concern that it might be disruptive. Also, a lack of knowledge about the value of physical activity and physical activity guidelines. I know that in my methods class, I've had to reflect, it's not really highlighted in my methods class. I make sure when students have to submit lesson plans or activity plans, they have to include social emotional learning, always. They have to include communication, always. And then other content is, also good. But I don't have and you have to include physical activity. And so that's making me think about how, what am I communicating and teaching to the next generation of teachers? We also know that teachers are influenced by parents. And how many of you have had parents, even with the young ones, who come in and their main concern is academics? Yeah. I think it's, it's common. School is viewed as the place for learning. And, for many of us, we think back to, we don't necessarily all remember what it felt like or was like before formal schooling start in kindergarten. So when we think back to learning, it's often at desks, maybe in rows even, if you're as old as, I'm not going to judge everybody here, but as old as me, I often was in a row, you had to sit. And so teachers take that on as that's, responding to the desires and concerns of the parents of making the environment more academic. And that has kind of a decreased value on the joyful aspects of learning. But we know from our developmentally appropriate practice that learning should be joyful for young children. And those will influence how teachers plan. We also know that, So a strategy for that, for those of you who might be administrators or have an ear on an administrator, would be thinking about our professional development. What is the content of the oh no, we're supposed to put a reference in there. How awkward. But we had a reference there that that Jiyun actually has, is that very few teachers do receive any content in their professional preparation about the importance and value of physical play. Some teachers have that in their background, and so they bring it in kind of naturally, but for those of us who are not the athletes growing up, we don't kind of naturally think about, I need to offer these opportunities to move around. So that is something for us in pre-professional training to focus on, but also in our professional development to think about how are we going to infuse that content on professional development, physical activity and professional development. And here's some topics, just in case you are planning professional development, thinking about both structured and unstructured physical activity, because there are times, the unstructured times, when the kids do it themselves. How do we make that okay? Sometimes our spaces don't make that okay. So how, can we make space to make that okay? But then also, in what ways can we structure physical activity that's still gonna be developmentally appropriate? Like, we don't need to necessarily set up soccer games, right? But we have our music and movement. Most classes have music and movement or something like that. But what other times can we have movement? Can we have encourage movement, for example, during transitions? Like, can kids skip from one place to the next instead of having to walk in an orderly fashion? And so on. We also want to think about professional development on that way to integrate the physical activity with the learning across domains. So that way it's not an either or. It's not well, the parents really, really, really want their kids to start reading at 3, but we can, teach physical activity along with alphabetic knowledge, for example. And then also thinking about addressing the physical activity needs of children with a range of abilities. Some kids, this is when my daughter was in her childcare setting between 1 and 3, she had another kid in the program who was like a week older than her. Like, they were so close in age. And he was Spider-Man. Like, he climbed everything. And meanwhile, my daughter is very, very cautious. So she would go out to the stairs, gripping, white knuckle gripping the banister and very cautiously step down. So how is that teacher gonna respond to that vast range of physical activity, proclivity? It's funny, now this daughter actually is the more active kid with swimming and running. But when she was 2, she was much more reserved. So how do we respond to that? So that's some topics for the professional development. Another strategy is thinking about unstructured physical activity integrated with other domains. Oh, here's just an example. So if we're thinking about unstructured physical activity, we can have thinking about how we set up an outdoor opportunity to toss a balloon or a ball up in the air and have the children count how many times they catch the ball or balloon. So if we're thinking about that sort of activity, what domains of development can be supported in this kind of unstructured free activity that we set out for the kids? Cognitive math, yeah. Language, because they're counting. Any other? Patterning. I think you're getting an A+. Any other domains? Gross motor. Would you?
Anything musically combines it.
Oh yeah. So if you add music into it, you can. Yeah.
Well, there might be some coordination or collaboration between the children.
Yeah.
On, organizing how
Yeah.
they're going to get that balloon
Yeah.
going.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So social, emotional, especially if we're working together. Yeah.
Together, yeah.
You guys did great. I don't think there's anything. So the physical hand-eye coordination, numeracy counting. Science. I'm sorry. That's one. So if we have the balloons versus the balls, one's going to be floating. And if you add the partners, you can have a comparison and social emotional again. You can also think about structured physical activity integrated with other domains. For example, setting up an obstacle course. This was my favorite, was collaborating with my occupational therapist, because they would be like, I'm going to bring all of my fun stuff because OTs have the fun stuff. I'm going to bring all of my fun stuff and set up an obstacle course. And like any kid can use it. It's not just for the students who have identified needs. And then I would be like, well, our theme, like we're doing the very hungry caterpillar. So like maybe we can have like the foods be like something that they're moving through, and it would be so much fun. So here's an example of like, you can set up the course and they have to follow a direction, like jump down the line while singing the ABCs, or name the colors on the hula hoops, or crawl like a bear through the tunnel. So what domains are going to be supported in that fun, structured activity? Yeah, what developmental domains, sorry? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So for those online, gross motor, language and literacy, anything else? Numeracy again. Pretend play, so we're actually, yes, yeah.
Probably also social emotional, turn taking and,
Yeah.
like reading the crowd and making sure that
Yeah.
not everybody's going at the same time.
Yeah, that social emotional self-regulation. I can't just like go. Turn taking. So let me see, what did we put? Fundamental movement. So that's from my kinesiology colleague. So crawling, jumping, running, following directions. We had the early literacy classification. What's a mathematic concept? Oh, but there was more that you guys listed that we didn't list. And then I kind of hinted at this already, but another strategy for those of us who are not physically active people and who maybe are thinking about this in a new way for the first time is to consider collaborating. If you have a PE or APE teacher, or again, an occupational therapist that you can work with, think about, can you go to collaborative workshops together? Can you engage with each other at conferences? Can you share publications and resources? Because we all have a different set of knowledge and expertise that we're bringing into the program, right? Also think about like whether you can co-plan your lessons or activities. And think about, like, if this is something that you really want to do, think about how you can garner the administrative support so that way you have the time to do those things. When you might have those places and times for those conversations. I know it can be tricky, and I'm going to gloss over it, that if we're working in inclusive settings, we're often coming together from different agencies, and so we have different expectations of what we do with our time. And so that can make it difficult, but think about, do we need to have a formal meeting, or can we use Google Docs for our co-planning? Where we share in our ideas and maybe we meet informally to like finalize everything, if that works. Another big challenge, I'm not gonna say that this isn't a big challenge, is the equipment and space that we have. And this is both indoor and outdoor. So sometimes when we're thinking about, well, both indoor and outdoor, sometimes the furniture that's in the environment might interfere with movement. Also, if our furniture is not made to be moved, then moving it's going to be inconvenient. So like, if we have our spaces defined by little bookshelves and whatnot, trying to move it out of the way so we have a bigger space to move around can be really difficult. Also, often the physical activity equipment available is insufficient. Like making sure that if we do have a play structure, it is age-appropriate play structure. This can be difficult as we're working on our early childhood campuses, especially right now as we're expanding TK, making sure that the TKs are in places where we have playground equipment for 4-year-olds. But then also thinking beyond the playground equipment to what other things are outside to use. Like, do we have things like tricycles? Do we have things like wheelbarrows? Do we have a nice grassy field? So, other than building a whole new environment, which we would love to be able to like build fancy new early childhood centers, but we live in the Bay Area, so we're probably not going to do that anytime soon. Some ideas, one is to employ movable furniture. So as we're thinking about getting the furniture for classrooms, if we can think about having things that are on casters or on wheels to easily move around. We also can think about as we're setting up our classrooms, thinking about activity zones. So having a space for big movements inside the classroom, so offering something like a trampoline or a tunnel or slides. I was like, is that anything? Slides are just fun. But also offering spaces for calming, like spaces that might incorporate different textures, reduce noise, and reduce light. So if kids are overwhelmed by the big, loud movements over there, I can move over to this other space in the classroom and calm down. And so we want to think about this balance of loud versus quiet. This is really easy to do in the abstract, but later on when we're looking at the case study that I provided, I picked this picture of a classroom because I often work through this with my students. You know, they have like columns just in the middle of the room for like no reason. So, so like you're not just working with a rectangle that you're building out. You have like, you know, furniture that was maybe bolted to the wall because we live in earthquake country. And so now how do we work around those limitations that we have in our classroom? But we often can come up with some really creative solutions. And then maximizing the use of our outdoor spaces. You know, working on, do we really have to limit it to the 30 minutes at a time? Everything you can do inside the classroom, you can do outside the classroom. You know, and I think I love it when I go to, you know, those centers that have like the art area outside and the, you know, and then your art becomes physical activity because you're like, hey, why not lay the paint, you know, the paint down and actually walk across or run across the canvas or the paper. Yeah, but we're not actually using canvases. And so thinking about that, also consider how natural objects might be used as instructional tools in the outdoor spaces because, you know, it gives us a different dimension. Not everything has to be the bright, colorful kids' toys. And then thinking about when we're using the outdoor space, thinking about how we can incorporate structured activities outside. So it's not just free play, thinking that everybody's gonna run around for 30 minutes. And I know this was sometimes a challenge when I was the lead teacher and I was working with my staff, because it was often also a time when we were working on breaks, because people do need to have breaks throughout the day. And so it was often like, oh, they can take a break during the outdoor time. So that would reduce our numbers and make it more challenging then, because kids are in a wider space, for us to do structured activities or to have intentional interactions with the kids. So you might think about, does it make sense to, you know, if there's another classroom on campus, does it actually make sense for us to join together during that time? Sometimes that might make sense. Sometimes that might not make sense. So we can coordinate that supervision so we're taking care of each other. Or do we maybe want to think about moving those breaks to a different time of the day? Would there be a time? It's like impossible to actually find a good time for people to take breaks, unless you have like kids napping. It's really difficult to find that good time. And then the next challenge we're going to introduce, and I'm sorry I'm running through this really fast, but I want to have time to do the activity, is thinking about children having varying abilities. So we don't have time to go into this is like an entire course on its own, of the ways that different disabilities impacting different domains impact physical activity. But just briefly, we can think about children who have disabilities that impact their motor development, often have differences in the way they coordinate their movement. And they also often have limited experiences participating in various physical activity. Like their parents might not have signed them up for ballet class or for, youth soccer. And so because they've been busy doing all these other things. And so we can think about how that's impacting their physical activity then when they come to us in the classroom. If their disability impacts their cognitive domain, they might have different ways of understanding rules and tactics for games. If their disability impacts the sensory perception, processing sensory information or processing multiple elements of sensory information may lead to sensory overload, or they also might have a lack sensitivity where they don't get the input that they need. And then if the disability impacts behavior, it can be, kids can end up, it can end up being difficult to engage them in physical activity if it's too easy or too difficult or too demanding, if it's unexpected, or if it's unclear. Those things can tend to lead to challenging behaviors. So that means like a tightrope. Is it too hard? Is it too easy? Is it too, to try and make sure that we're getting something that's like meaningfully engaging and exciting for the child to engage in. But I'm sure you guys have thought a lot about universal design for learning. If you haven't talked about it in this conference, it's like almost in every inclusion collaborative conference session I go to. But we can think about the ways that we use these strategies to address the varying needs that children will have across those domains. So we can think about engagement. We can think about incorporating choice, for example. So if a child, and so what we did here is we kind of put the domain that was most relevant next to the strategy. So if a child has a disability impacting motor development, you might consider lighter objects or bigger objects as easier to manipulate. So offering those as a choice within a spectrum of objects and objects used for the activities. We also might think about how can we relate the materials to the child's interests. I wish I could share this video with you guys, but it's like, I'm not allowed to share it. It's from the Embedded Instruction California, and they have this beautiful video of a teacher setting up a structured physical activity with some kids on the playground. One of the boys has disability impacting his motor movement, and so they're trying to encourage him to climb and move around more. And so she makes them like hunters, and she hides Star Wars characters on the play structure. And they like it's a group of kids, they're like all into Star Wars, because who isn't? Even my kids who like don't watch Star Wars are into Star Wars. And they go and they hunt, and this kid was like just, loving it and climbing. But he really needed that structure of thinking about what's gonna motivate you to participate, right? We can also think about simplifying tasks if we're thinking about games, thinking about different levels of participation. Many of us work in multi-age classrooms already, so we can think about like it's not just for a child with a cognitive delay or a motor delay, but rather thinking about at the different age levels and levels of development, we might have different ways of engaging, and then anyone can engage at the level that is appropriate to them. We also might want to think about giving a preview, especially for kids who like struggle with surprise. Some kids, that's like really motivating, like, oh, there's a surprise. Other kids, maybe we want to give them a preview of the activity. We also want to be always watching for those signs of frustration, boredom, or if they're getting overwhelmed due to sensory overload. And then thinking about the alternating of the high physical activity with the calmer activities in the classroom, because we don't always need to be sweating. We can also think about using our different means of representation, and this is a lot of visual strategies, but thinking about like the visual schedules, the visual rule reminders. A lot of time when we do physical activity, we don't necessarily have those visuals as readily available as we do when we're sitting at circle, and like it's right here on the wall. And so we want to think about how can we bring those visuals outside with us? How can we bring them into the activity area so that way they're where the kids can refer to them? And then thinking action and expression-wise, thinking about the alternate modes of engagement, and then the alternative equipment or assistive technologies, and that's where collaborating with an APE teacher is really helpful, because they have a much bigger catalog in their head of different strategies that can be employed. Also thinking about how can we give options for maybe slowing down or simplifying the tasks again. So other than saying make sure you're paying attention to the sensory needs, I didn't have these strategies embedded into that previous slide, But I think it is useful for us to think about, again, our classrooms having ways to both avoid sensory overload and provide extra sensory stimulation for any child, having those options always available. Things like noise canceling headphones, like we know that some children have disabilities that influence that sensory overload, but I remember my brother, who never had any sort of diagnosis, being the kid just like, covering his ears all the time because it was just, things were just too loud for him. He now works in sound. That's his job. So it's a strength of his, but it was overwhelming for him when he was a little kid. And having the clear boundaries for personal space, if we're doing things like having a trampoline, like what are the rules there? And then also thinking about having the kind of calming breaks embedded and opportunities embedded. Or recognizing like a short amount of engagement is all that this child needs. Like we don't need to try and force children to spend 20 minutes in this loud, boisterous activity. They shouldn't be doing things for 20 minutes when they're in early childhood, in preschool. Okay, so now, good, we have about 20 minutes for our activity. Whew. So now I'm going to turn your attention to the case study. For those of you joining us online, I did put this, it's on the app, so hopefully you can access it. But I created this case study that really briefly describes a teacher who is trying to address the physical activity needs of the children in her classroom. And so you have her little story, you have the picture, and so this is the color picture of this classroom, and then her daily schedule. And then on the back of that handout, you have a place for notes where you could use the different strategies that we talked about. Maybe think about different ideas for Suzanne, this teacher, to take back to her classroom. And so I'll go ahead and give you guys 5 minutes to start, and then see if you guys want to partner up with anybody to talk about different ideas. I hear good conversations, and it kills me to stop you guys, but we have 10 minutes. I got my 10-minute warning. So I want us to have a time to share out your ideas, and I will do my best to repeat those for those of you online. So does anybody want to share out? I think I noticed actually several people marking up the schedule. And so I'm curious what you commented on related to the schedule before we go to the strategies on the back. Does anybody want to share their thoughts? Come on.
So, yeah, you're watching me.
Yeah.
Over the schedule. So there are way too many transitions in the schedule for my comfort.
Yeah.
I feel like that there's, in order to provide optimal opportunity for physical activity, you could put a block of the time together in the morning and afternoon from like 9:20 to 11:30, and you just block the time together. And you can offer a circle moment and open snack time during that time, and the children can choose to participate in those opportunities.
Yeah.
And they would have physical movement during that time. They would also have opportunity to be outdoors during that time. So there would be length of time and less transition.
Yeah.
And then you do your cleanup at the end, and then you have your story to kind of wind them down before lunch. So.
Excellent. So for those of you joining online, I think that is what I would recommend to this teacher as well, is there's just so many transitions that like the free play time is constricted to 40 minutes. That's free play plus learning centers available. So instead of thinking of it as every child needs to go to each of these things at the same time, thinking about putting it, all of these is basically choices. You can have snack as a choice, set a circle time as a choice. Now, this is something that I say to my developing teachers, and then they get in trouble for, is I say, you don't need to have circle time. Like that, doing calendar, like, especially if you're working with 3-year-olds, do they understand calendar? But then the administrators come in and they're like, you're not doing it, you're not doing preschool right. But offering that as a choice for the kids who are into like the numbers and the activities over there, having it all of these opportunities more in a rotation, so you're not trying to get every kid through every transition. Instead, they're transitioning when it makes sense for them. And then including as an opportunity within this, being outdoors and also physical activity. Great. Anybody else have any comments on the schedule? Because it wasn't just my friend up here that I saw writing notes on the schedule.
Like that, there's a lot of activities that are at the tabletop.
Mm-hmm.
My question is, does she have alternative seating?
Mm-hmm.
Does she have wiggle seats? Does she have, or is it chairs? Or
Mm-hmm.
can they stand? Do they have,
Yeah.
bands around the feet,
Thank-
the feet of the chair
Yeah.
for wiggly feet?
That's a really good point. And if you look at this picture, which I just found on Wiki Commons, because I don't want anybody to sue me for using their pictures. But and this is not atypical, right? These are all kind of that old style chair, kids chair. And this teacher is having the kids really go from table to table. And there's other things that you could do in this classroom, other places you can sit. You could be standing. You could have different types of seating. Really great comment. Okay.
And like you said, circle time doesn't just have to be calendar and weather, especially if you're with younger ages.
Yeah.
And if you are doing calendar, make it more like patterning. And
Yeah.
number recognition.
Yeah.
Because time is
Yeah.
relative.
What is, it's the time before I slept? Well, that was before nap. Yeah.
And we both actually had the idea with that particular classroom, having a sensory path.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I heard you guys commenting, like maybe making use of this like kind of not really well utilized space near the entry. Is that what you guys were talking about? Yeah. And making it more of a sensory path, sensory exploration area. I love that idea.
Even just putting mats on the floor and having like those little, I was just in a preschool classroom supporting their short staff, and they have these bouncer things where they actually, the kids jump into a beanbag.
Oh, that's
And
lovely.
they had this heavy weighted tube, I don't know what it was, but the kids loved going in and just rolling.
Yeah.
Just so that they can self-select, so when it says the self-selection part of that,
Mm-hmm.
that sensory, not just tabletop activity, but
Yeah.
that menu.
Yeah.
And then they just use icons to say only 2 kids can go to this at a time.
Yeah.
And when they get there, they turn on a little timer, so they try and make
Yeah.
sure that other people have a turn.
Yeah. So for those of you joining in, thinking about the equipment, can you bring in beanbag chairs or, again, this is probably like an OT or APE, bringing in like fun equipment that all kids want to play with. It can be used therapeutically with, people who know that how to, 5 minutes, but it's also something that can be really a fun exploration or a fun opportunity to move my body because I'm 4 and I have movement in my body that wants to come out. So we only have 5 minutes, so quickly, we are not going to be able to go through all, what is this, 9 strategies we have on the back here. But I'm wondering if anybody wants to share a strategy that they had for Suzanne using the back table here. Yes, go ahead.
I really like the strategy of outdoor learning
Mm-hmm.
and being able to take things outside of the classroom.
Yeah.
All this that we're discussing brings me back to my childhood.
Mhm.
Went to Montessori school for preschool and kindergarten, and everything that you explained is like that
Mhm.
to a T.
Yeah.
And not at the time, I was 4 or 5 years old, didn't
Mhm.
realize the value of it. but seeing how different the rest of my education was, structured, rows, classrooms, you get recess, and that's it for, you know, so different. So seeing the ways to incorporate that, where it doesn't even feel like learning, but it is learning, and it's channeling
Yeah.
the different ways of learning and the different pathways of making it. I mean, like, you felt like you could do what you wanted, but not in a bad way. Like, you had the freedom to choose,
Yeah.
and just different ways of learning other than a book, an exam,
Yeah.
read the book, write a report, blah, blah, blah.
And so that was echoing the thinking outside of the classroom, thinking about using the outdoor space and providing those opportunities really intentionally for kids to be able to make different choices and to do what kind of they need to do as they are learning and developing. And we know kids do that. We know that they will get into, you know, like I'm learning about bugs. And so I'm like into bugs right now. And, you know, you can spend all of your time trying to dig pull them away. But if they are able to go and explore in that area, you can intentionally think about how are we going to build learning around bugs. There's lots of things we can learn. Any other strategies that you would recommend for Suzanne? Anybody wants to share? Oh, I have 1 minute. Okay, there's my 1 minute.
Really quick, the outside time, it's pretty standard. A lot of times I see swings, trikes, and slides. But, you know, adding easels for painting.
Yeah.
Or even, what we did was, you know, those plastic clear dividers that
Oh, yeah.
for COVID?
Uh-huh.
So we zip tied them to the fence,
Mhm.
and we put these tempera mark poster paint.
Oh,
and the kids
that's
would
fun.
paint on
On those clear,
repurposing them,
yeah,
and it's really fun, and they're standing
and they're able to,
and
excellent.
balancing boards
Oh,
and
whoops.
standing sensory
Okay.
tables.
Yeah, there's lots of fun. Yeah, you don't need to think about just like trikes, bikes, and slides, but thinking about like all these other experiences. You know, go to the Discovery Museum and see what they did with their outdoor space and see what can we bring it back. Yeah. So this is just it's our moral obligation to include children together. I think Shelley Moore did a really good job of explaining that to us. So I don't necessarily need to repeat it, but if you have any questions or want to reach out, there is our email addresses and we'll get back to you. So thank you guys. Thank you for being engaging. I know it's hard after lunch. Afternoon slump.